The first time I noticed the house across the road, it was because the light in the upstairs window turned off exactly when I looked at it. That might not sound like much. People turn off lights all the time. You glance at a house, a room goes dark, and that's the end of the thought. But the thing about quiet places is that they teach you to notice patterns whether you want to or not. My name's Daniel Harker. I was 44 when I moved to that road, and I had reached the stage in life where silence was starting to feel less like peace and more like something you had to negotiate with. The house I rented sat on a narrow stretch of county road about 20 minutes outside Dayton. Nothing dramatic about it. One story, pale siding, small porch, and a gravel drive that always made a little too much noise when cars rolled over it. I had moved there after my divorce. That sentence always sounds heavier than it felt at the time. The truth is the divorce itself wasn't explosive. No shouting, no broken dishes. Just the slow understanding between two people that whatever used to exist between them had stopped existing long enough ago that pretending otherwise had become embarrassing. So we stopped. She kept the house in the suburbs. I took the quiet place out near the fields. Most evenings I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and listened to the insects change their rhythm as the sun went down. That was the routine. The kind that doesn't look like much from the outside but slowly becomes the structure of your days. The road only had 5 houses along it, each sitting far enough apart that you could believe you were alone if you didn't look too carefully. Mine was the third. The house across from me, the one with the upstairs light, belonged to a man named Leonard Pike. I learned that about 2 weeks after moving in when the mail carrier mentioned him. "You won't see him much," she said casually while handing me a stack of envelopes. "Keeps to himself." "That bad?" "Not bad," she said. "Just quiet." That was enough explanation for me. Quiet men don't usually interest other quiet men. You learn to leave each other alone. For the first month, I barely thought about the place. The blinds were usually half closed. The yard stayed trimmed, but never freshly cut. Once every few days, a small silver sedan would pull out of the gravel drive around mid-morning and come back sometime after dark. That was it. Ordinary patterns. But then small things began to add themselves together. Not all at once. Slowly, the way small details do when they're patient. The first one was the light. Every night around 10, the upstairs window facing the road would turn on. And every night, about 10 minutes later, it would turn off again. Exactly 10 minutes. The precision of that caught my attention. Not immediately in a suspicious way. More in the way you notice someone who always arrives at the same seat in a diner at the same time each morning. Routine can look like discipline or loneliness depending on how long you watch it. The second thing I noticed was that the rest of the house stayed dark. Always. Kitchen dark. Living room dark. Porch light never used. Just that one upstairs room. 10 minutes of light. Then nothing. I told myself it was probably a bedroom. Maybe Leonard Pike read before bed. Maybe he liked the lamp by the window. People create rituals when they live alone. I understood that. But the third thing was harder to explain. One evening in late November, I came home later than usual. Work had run long, and the sky had already gone black by the time I turned onto the road. My headlights slid across the Pike house as I passed, and in that moment, I saw the upstairs window already glowing. I checked the clock in the truck. 9:48. Earlier than usual. It's strange how small differences can feel important. I parked in my drive and sat there for a minute watching the house through the windshield. The light stayed on. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then the light went out. No movement. No shadow crossing the blinds. Just darkness again. I didn't think much about it until the next night. And the night after that. Because the time had changed. Now the light came on around 9:45 and stayed on until almost 10:15. The pattern had shifted. And once you notice a pattern breaking, you can't stop checking it. That was when I started paying closer attention. Not in an obsessive way. Just quietly. The way a man might watch the weather when he suspects a storm is forming somewhere beyond the horizon. A week later, I was on the porch when the silver sedan pulled into Leonard Pike's drive. It was the first time I had actually seen the man clearly. He stepped out slowly, like someone careful about his knees. Tall, thin, gray coat, maybe late 60s. He stood beside the car for a moment before walking toward the front door. Not looking around exactly, but not ignoring the world either. There's a certain way older men move when they've learned the value of noticing things without making it obvious. He had that kind of walk. The porch light at my place was on. He glanced in my direction, not long enough to call it staring. just long enough to acknowledge another person existed across the road. I gave a small wave. He nodded once. Then he went inside. The upstairs light came on exactly 12 minutes later. I remember that because I checked the time without realizing I was doing it. After that, I began noticing other things. The sedan didn't leave every morning anymore. Some days it stayed parked. But the upstairs light routine never stopped. 10 minutes. Almost always 10. Sometimes 9. Once 11. Never longer. And always that same room. By December the fields had turned stiff and colorless. The insects were gone, replaced by the dry rattle of wind through old grass and the occasional distant bark of a dog somewhere down the county road. Winter quiet is different from summer quiet. Heavier. More deliberate. One night, a few days before Christmas, I stepped out onto the porch around 10 with a cup of coffee. The upstairs light across the road was already on. I leaned against the railing and watched it without really meaning to. 7 minutes passed. Then 8. Then 9. The light went out. But this time something else happened. A shadow moved behind the blinds. Not crossing the window. Just appearing. Like someone had stepped closer to the glass. I waited. Nothing more happened. Eventually the cold drove me back inside. I forgot about it until the next afternoon when I walked down the road to check the mailbox. Leonard Pike's mailbox sat about 30 yards before mine. As I passed it, I noticed something stuck under the metal flag. A folded piece of paper. For a moment, I assumed it had blown there from somewhere else. But when I looked closer, I saw a name written across the front in careful handwriting. Daniel. My name. No last name. Just Daniel. I stood there in the quiet road with the fields stretching away on both sides and the Pike house watching from across the ditch. There are a lot of reasonable explanations a person can reach for in a moment like that. Maybe the mail carrier left it. Maybe Pike wanted to introduce himself and didn't want to walk across the road. Maybe it had been there all morning and I simply hadn't noticed. But when I opened the paper, the handwriting inside stopped those explanations from feeling comfortable. The message was short. Only one sentence. If you see the light stay on longer than usual, please come knock on my door. No signature. But the handwriting matched the name on the front. Careful. Deliberate. Like someone who had spent a lifetime making sure their words looked orderly. I folded the note again and looked back toward the house. The upstairs window was dark. No car in the drive. No movement anywhere. Just the quiet field road and the pale siding of a house that now felt slightly different than it had that morning. I kept the note in my coat pocket. At first I told myself I'd ask him about it the next time I saw him. But the next time I saw Leonard Pike wasn't quite what I expected. 2 nights later the upstairs light came on at 9:47. I was on the couch reading when I noticed it through the front window. 10 minutes passed. The light stayed on. 12 minutes. Still on. 15. I stood up without really deciding to. The note in my pocket felt heavier than paper should. At 18 minutes I was already putting on my coat. By the time I stepped onto the porch, the light across the road had been burning for 22 minutes. And that was the first time I realized something else about the window. The blinds weren't fully closed anymore. There was a narrow gap in the middle, just wide enough that from the porch, if I leaned slightly against the railing, I could see that the room was completely empty. I stood there on the porch longer than I should have. At first, I told myself I must be looking at the wrong part of the room. That maybe Leonard Pike had stepped out for a moment. Maybe there was a bathroom attached. Maybe he had gone downstairs and forgotten to turn the lamp off. But the longer I watched through the narrow gap in the blinds, the clearer the room became. There was a small table under the window. A lamp with a base shade. A chair pushed neatly against the wall. No movement. No shadow. Nothing that looked like a person. The light had now been on for almost 25 minutes. The note in my coat pocket came back to me then. If you see the light stay on longer than usual, please come knock on my door. I remember thinking something very simple at that moment. Either Leonard Pike had written that note for exactly the situation, or he hadn't written it at all. Neither explanation made the walk across the road feel easier. The gravel shifted under my boots as I stepped off the porch and crossed the narrow strip of grass toward the road. The cold had settled improperly by then, the kind that makes the air feel thinner in your lungs. The Pike house looked different up close. Not abandoned. Not neglected. Just paused. The front yard had been trimmed sometime recently, but the edges were soft again where winter grass had grown uneven. The porch light above his door remained off, even though the rest of the house was dark. Only the upstairs room glowed. From the yard, I could see more clearly through the gap in the blinds. Still empty. That bothered me more than if someone had been standing there. I reached the gravel drive and paused. A strange thing about quiet roads is that every small decision feels louder than it should. I could have turned around then, gone back to my porch, pretended I'd misread the note. But routine has its own gravity. And for nearly 2 months, I had watched that light follow its precise 10-minute life each night. Now it wasn't. That felt like something I'd already agreed to pay attention to. So I walked up the drive. The silver sedan was there, parked where it always was, angled slightly toward the road as if ready to leave. Frost had formed lightly across the windshield. That suggested it hadn't moved for a while. The front door stood only a few steps beyond the car. A plain wooden door with a brass knob and a mail slot near the bottom. I knocked. The sound carried into the house and came back thin through the wood. Nothing. I waited a moment and knocked again, a little louder. Still nothing. I looked up toward the glowing window. The light didn't change. I thought about the note again. It hadn't said call. It hadn't said shout his name. It had said knock. So I knocked a third time. That was when I heard the movement inside. Not footsteps. Something else. A slow dragging sound across the floor somewhere deeper in the house. I felt the muscles along my back tighten. "Mr. Pike," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the cold. The dragging sound stopped. Then came a pause long enough that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. After a few seconds, the door opened. Not wide, just enough that the chain lock held it a few inches apart. Leonard Pike's face appeared in the gap. Up close he looked older than he had from across the road. The kind of older that settles into a man gradually, until one day you realize his bones seem closer to the surface than they used to be. His eyes moved from my face to the yard behind me, then to the upstairs window. "You saw the light," he said. His voice was steady but thin. "Yes." "How long?" "About 25 minutes. He nodded slowly, like someone confirming a measurement. "Good," he said. The word felt misplaced. "Good. Yes." He looked at the chain on the door, as if considering whether it should stay where it was. Then he said something that made the quiet road behind me feel suddenly farther away. "Did you look through the window before you came over?" I hesitated. "Yes." "In the room?" "Empty." Another slow nod. That's what I expected. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Mr. Pike," I said carefully, "is everything all right?" He gave a small tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No," he said, "but it is exactly what I prepared for." He studied me for a moment longer. "Did you bring the note?" "It's in my pocket." "Good." He lifted one hand and slowly removed the chain. The door opened wider. "Come inside for a minute," he said, "before the light goes out." The hallway behind him smelled faintly of dust and something medicinal. The interior of the house looked much like mine did. Simple furniture, careful order, the quiet economy of someone living alone. I stepped in, and he closed the door behind me. Immediately the house felt warmer than outside, but not comfortably so. More like the air had been sitting still for too long. He didn't offer to take my coat. Instead he walked toward the staircase at the end of the hall and motioned for me to follow. "The timing matters," he said. "What timing?" "The lamp." I glanced toward the upstairs glow. "It's been on longer than usual." "Yes. That's why you wrote the note." He paused at the foot of the stairs and looked back at me. "I wrote the note because eventually that would happen." Then he started up. The staircase creaked under our weight in slow, deliberate sounds. The kind you can't hurry even if you try. When we reached the top, the light from the room spilled across the hallway floor. Leonard Pike stopped outside the door. "Before we go in," he said quietly, "I want you to answer one question honestly." "What question?" "Since you moved here, have you ever seen anyone leave this house?" I frowned. "I've seen you leave. Have you seen anyone else?" "No. Not even by accident." "No." He seemed satisfied with that. "Good." He opened the door. The room looked exactly the way it had from the porch. Small. Neat. Lamp glowing on the table beneath the window. Chair against the wall. No one inside. Leonard Pike walked directly to the lamp and looked down at the base of it. Then he checked his watch. 32 minutes, he murmured. "What does that mean?" "It means we're a little late." "For what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and gently adjusted the blinds so the gap closed. Then he turned back toward me. "You were right about the room," he said. "There's no one here." "I told you that." "Yes." He rested his hand on the back of the chair. "But there should be." I stared at him. What? For the past 6 years, he said quietly, someone has stood in that corner every night while the lamp is on. The room seemed to get colder, even though nothing had changed. You're saying someone was in here every night? Yes. And you knew about it? Of course. Why didn't you call the police? Leonard Pike looked genuinely surprised by the question. Because the police cannot arrest a person who isn't in the room. I felt a tightness in my chest. What are you talking about? He gestured toward the corner of the room opposite the window, the place where the wall met the wardrobe. That is where he stands. I looked. There was nothing there except a patch of worn carpet. You've been watching an empty corner? Not empty. He checked his watch again. Normally the light goes off after 10 minutes. When it does, he leaves. My throat felt dry. Leaves how? Leonard Pike gave that same tired half smile. That's the part I've been trying to understand. Silence settled over the room. 33 minutes. 34. The lamp continued glowing steadily on the table. Leonard Pike frowned. He should be gone by now. Gone where? Back to wherever he waits during the day. Mr. Pike. But before I could finish the sentence, the lamp flickered once. Just once. Then went dark. The room fell in a sudden shadow, except for the dim hallway light behind us. Leonard Pike looked at the corner again. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Well, he said. Well, what? That's new. I glanced at the corner. Still empty. Then something caught my eye near the baseboard. A faint indentation in the carpet. Like the mark left behind after a piece of furniture has been standing in one place for a long time. Except the shape was wrong. Too narrow. Too straight. More like the outline of a person who had been standing very still for years. I felt a cold line run up my spine. Mr. Pike, I said quietly. Yes. How long did you say he's been standing there? He answered without looking away from the corner. 6 years. I swallowed. And tonight is the first time he didn't leave when the light went out. Yes. The quiet in the room deepened. Outside, the wind moved softly across the fields. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then Leonard Pike said something that made the air in the house feel suddenly much heavier. If he didn't leave, he said calmly, then he must have followed you here. For a few seconds after he said that, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't hear him. Because some sentences take a moment to arrive fully. They sit in the air, quiet and unfinished, until your mind decides whether they belong to the world you understand or the one you've been trying to avoid. He followed me. I repeated. Leonard Pike nodded once, slowly. Yes. The room had gone almost completely dark after the lamp switched off. The only light now came from the hallway behind us, stretching a dull yellow strip across the floorboards. I looked again at the corner. There was still nothing there, but the indentation in the carpet seemed more noticeable now that I knew what I was looking at. Not deep, just persistent, like a place that had been occupied long enough for the fibers to remember it. You've been watching that corner for 6 years? I asked. Yes. And you're certain someone was standing there? Yes. Every night? Yes. I rubbed my hands together without realizing I was doing it. The room had cooled quickly once the lamp went dark. Why would anyone do that? Leonard Pike walked slowly toward the window and looked through the closed blinds. I asked myself that question for a long time, he said. Eventually I realized I'd been asking the wrong one. What's the right one? Why would someone want me to know they were there? That wasn't an answer I liked. Are you saying this was intentional? Yes. For what purpose? He turned back toward me. To see how long I would keep noticing. The quiet in the room thickened again. 6 years, I said. Yes. That's a long experiment. Leonard Pike gave a tired smile. Lonely men are very patient subjects. That line settled somewhere uncomfortable in my chest. I looked around the room more carefully now. There wasn't much to it. A narrow bed along the wall opposite the window. A wardrobe. The small table with a lamp. No photographs. No television. No books. It felt less like a bedroom and more like a place designed for a single task. You sit here every night, I asked, in that chair, and watch the corner, and watch the corner, for 10 minutes. Yes. And when the lamp turns off, he leaves. That has always been the pattern. Until tonight. Yes. I walked slowly toward the spot in the carpet. Up close the indentation was clearer. The fibers leaned slightly inward, as though something had pressed down on them repeatedly. But there was still no visible cause. I crouched down. You mind if I check something? Leonard Pike didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "Go ahead." I placed my hand flat against the carpet where the indentation ended. The fabric felt cold, colder than the rest of the room. That might have been my imagination, but it was enough to make me pull my hand back again. "You ever tried touching it before?" I asked. "No. Why not?" He thought about that for a moment. I suppose I didn't want to interfere with the routine. I stood up again. The hallway light flickered slightly behind us. "Mr. Pike," I said carefully, "you understand how this sounds." "Yes. You might be dealing with something simpler, such as memory, habit, a trick of the eye. That would have been comforting 6 years ago," he said. "But not now." "No. Why?" He nodded toward the window. "Because he started writing." I blinked. "Writing?" Leonard Pike walked over to the wardrobe and opened the door. Inside, hanging neatly from a hook, was a long strip of paper. It looked like something torn from a receipt roll or an adding machine spool. Thin, white, covered in handwriting. He removed it carefully and handed it to me. "Every morning," he said, "after the light goes out, I check the corner. And sometimes I find these." I took the strip of paper. The handwriting was small and cramped, running down the length of the roll in uneven lines. The first few words stopped me cold. "You finally noticed the pattern." I read further. It took longer than expected. Another line beneath it. "But that happens with quiet men." My mouth felt dry. "Who wrote this?" "That is the question," Leonard Pike said. I scanned the paper again. There were dozens of lines written at different times. Short observations, comments, questions. "You sat closer to the window tonight. You checked your watch 3 times. You considered leaving on February 12th. You stayed anyway." The handwriting was consistent, but slightly uneven, as though written quickly. "How many of these have you found?" 7, Pike said. "And you never showed them to anyone?" "I showed one to the sheriff 3 years ago." "What did he say?" "That I should stop leaving notes to myself." I handed the strip back to him slowly. "Do you believe that?" "No." "Why not?" Leonard Pike looked toward the corner again. "Because the handwriting isn't mine." I didn't know what to say to that. Outside, the wind picked up slightly and rattled something loose against the side of the house. The sound carried through the walls like distant knocking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I remembered something. "You said he's been here 6 years." "Yes. And he always leaves when the light goes out." "That's correct. But tonight he didn't." "Yes." I glanced toward the hallway. "So if he followed me here." Leonard Pike nodded. "Then he should be somewhere in the house." That sentence made the air feel suddenly thinner. "Have you checked the rest of the rooms?" "No." "Why not?" "Because if he followed you," Pike said quietly, "then the pattern has changed." "What does that mean?" "It means the rules are no longer mine." I didn't like that answer. I stepped out into the hallway and looked down the staircase. The lower floor sat in darkness, except for the faint glow of the porch light through the front window. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the house felt different than when I entered. Not hostile, just occupied. I walked halfway down the stairs. "Mr. Pike," I called quietly. "Yes." "Have you ever seen him?" "No. Not even once." "Not directly." "What does that mean?" Leonard Pike appeared at the top of the stairs behind me. "It means sometimes I see him in reflections." I turned slowly. Reflections. In the window glass. In the mirror on the wardrobe door. And he hesitated. "What?" "Once in the television screen, when it was turned off." "What did he look like?" Leonard Pike took a long time to answer. When he did, his voice sounded distant, like someone who had been standing still for a very long time. I felt a shiver move up the back of my neck. We stood there listening. Nothing. Then something small happened. So small that if the house had been noisier, I might have missed it. A faint sound from the living room, like fabric shifting slightly against wood. Leonard Pike heard it too. Our eyes met. Neither of us spoke. Slowly, we walked down the rest of the stairs. The living room opened to the left of the hallway, dark except for the pale square of moonlight falling through the front window. I stepped into the doorway. At first I saw nothing unusual. Just the couch. A small table. The television set. Then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed something in the reflection of the dark TV screen. A shape. Tall. Standing behind us in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't turn around immediately. Instead, I kept looking at the reflection. The shape didn't move. Didn't shift. Just stood there. Exactly where Leonard Pike had said it would. In the same posture someone might hold if they had been standing patiently for years. I felt Leonard Pike step closer beside me. "Do you see him?" he whispered. "Yes." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, very slowly, I turned around. The hallway behind us was empty. No one there. I looked back at the television. The reflection was gone. The screen showed only the room again. Leonard Pike let out a quiet breath. That's the closest anyone has come to him, he said. I stared at the blank screen. Then something else occurred to me. Mr. Pike. Yes. You said you wrote the note because the light staying on longer would mean something had changed. Yes. What exactly did you think would happen? He thought about that carefully. Then he answered in the calmest voice I had heard all night. I believed that if the pattern broke, he would finally stop observing. I waited, and Leonard Pike looked toward the hallway behind us and start participating.